Okay, good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. A few people are still joining, so my colleague Paula will be letting them in as they arrive. I'm Hannah Randall. I'm the head of learning here at Holocaust Centre North. And as I said, I'm joined online by our curator of contemporary practices, Paula Kohler, who's going to help with the tech side of things. And tonight we're joined by our speaker, Dr. Rebecca Jinks. So a few technical things to mention as always. We will be monitoring the chat box, so if you have any questions throughout the event, please put them there and we'll get to as many as possible at the end. Talk will be about 45 minutes and then we'll have 15 minutes for questions or a discussion, and we'll finish promptly at 6. And throughout the event, if you can please remain muted, and then we'll have the questions at the end. We are going to record the event, as you probably heard as you joined, and tomorrow you'll receive a link for the recording and a short online survey. So if you can give any feedback, both to us as the centre running the event and Rebecca in terms of her the talk, we can pass that on. It's all really useful for all of us. But before I pass over to Rebecca, I'm just going to give her a little introduction. So Rebecca Jinks is a historian of comparative genocide and humanitarianism. Her first book, Representing Genocide, the Holocaust as a Paradigm, in 2016, examines the ways in which Holocaust representations have influenced representations of other genocides. Her current project explores women's experiences during the Armenian and the Yezidi genocides and humanitarian responses in the aftermath. So this talk tonight is based on the research currently that's on display in an exhibition entitled Genocidal Captivity, Retelling the Stories of Armenian and Yezidi Women at the Wiener Holocaust Library in London until the 31st of May, so you've got about a week to get down and visit if you're local. But without further ado, I will hand over to Rebecca. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. Thank you for inviting me tonight. I am going to just share my PowerPoint. Is that all looking okay? Yep. Brilliant, thank you. Okay, here we go then. So, I remember all my story. As long as I'm alive, I will remember it. I will not forget it. I can't tell you all of it. 10 days would not be long enough. I'm starting with these quotes from Yezidi women who survived genocidal captivity, who I interviewed last year in northern Iraq for a number of reasons. And first, I think because they indicate something of the monumentality, the kind of severity and the trauma of their experiences. Second, because I think they also indicate one of the challenges that historians also face, which is how do we tell this history? How do you condense years, 10 years, into a word count, or tonight into 40 minutes? But thirdly, I'm starting with these quotes because in the political space of present-day Iraq, they're also claims in two senses. It's a claim that they remember everything and can therefore reproduce a comprehensive and accurate retelling of their experiences of captivity under Islamic State. And that's then the basis for the second claim, which is a financial claim of compensation from the Iraq government. And that compensation is a lifeline for these internally displaced people, but it's also a compensation that the government denies whenever it can. So the stakes placed on this remembering are actually extremely high. I'll return a little bit to the politics of present-day Iraq and the living situation of the Yezidi people towards the end of this talk, but I'm going to start out instead with that first challenge, an overview of Islamic State genocide against the Yezidis, and I'll weave in testimonies from the women that I interviewed last year in Iraq. And I'll focus particularly on 3 women. Hadia, who's a bright and very strong-willed young woman. She was 15 in 2014, and she lived in a mixed ethnicity town called Domis. Safia, who is a very tiny and quiet young woman. She was 14 in 2014, and she didn't seem an awful lot older than that when I interviewed her last year. She lived in the town of Kocho, and that was mostly inhabited by Yezidis. And Amira, who was a little bit older, she was 24 in 2014, already had children, lived with her husband in a town called Gohbal. but I'll also at times bring in the testimonies of some of the other women that I interviewed. So let's start out with background. I'm going to be showing a lot of maps, I warn you, first because I don't have permission to display many portraits of the survivors, because there's often a backlash on social media, and second because I like maps, which anyone close to me will tell you. So today is kind of a celebration of Google Earth's capabilities. So in early 2014, Iraq's politics and society were deeply fractured. The US-led invasion and occupation of Iraq in 2003 had failed in its aim of creating a kind of viable democratic politics. And during this occupation, Saddam Hussein's ruling Ba'athist Party, which was dominated by Arab Sunnis, was deposed, and former Ba'athist politicians and civil servants were banned from office. So after that, many Arab Sunnis basically refused to take part in the political process. And into that vacuum stepped Shia and Kurdish parties instead. So politics and society became increasingly sectarian. The government basically struggled to function. Disaffected citizens were increasingly drawn to religious radicalism, especially young men without prospects, and especially Sunnis who had lost their jobs and prestige. And one underground group which particularly attracted these disaffected Sunnis was the Islamic State of Iraq. It was formed in 2004 and originally allied to al-Qaeda in the insurgency against the American occupation. So after the Arab Spring spread to Syria in 2011, which triggered civil war, the Islamic State of Iraq gradually also established itself in Syria. And it recruited mostly former Baathists and other Sunnis from Iraq and abroad. In 2013, it split from al-Qaeda. It renamed itself Islamic State in Iraq and Syria, ISIS, and it focused on capturing territory. And in 2014, January, ISIS declared the Syrian city of Raqqa its capital. But it had also maintained an underground presence in Iraq. And in this context of sectarian violence and Arab Sunni protests that sprang up, it also captured the city of Fallujah and nearby towns, and that's quite close to Baghdad, so it was highly problematic for the government. On the 4th of June 2014, ISIS attacked Mosul, Iraq's second city, and it fell, Mosul, 6 days later, which was somewhat embarrassing for all of the American aid that had gone into the military. So by the end of June, ISIS controlled quite a significant proportion of Iraq's territory. The leader, Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, triumphantly declared the establishment of a caliphate or an Islamic State, and it renamed itself again, this time simply Islamic State. So it symbolically undid those borders. In each new territory, ISIS recruited members, and it imposed its really quite strict conservative laws and way of life. And its vision was of an ever-expanding Islamic State, which would conform to the original texts and practices of the very early pious Muslims. That's a movement within Islam known as Salafism. And this space that they controlled was supposed to be cleansed both of political dissent and also religious difference. And that included Christians, Jews, Shia Muslims, Yezidis, and also Sunnis who refused to follow ISIS's own interpretation of Sunni Islam. So between these prized cities of Raqqa and Mosul lay the Sinjar region. So to link its territories into a new contiguous state, ISIS needed to control Sinjar. This is a map showing the situation on the 20th of June, a little bit before the declaration of the caliphate, where the black indicates, as you can see, areas of complete ISIS control. The paler red areas are places where the population tended to support them, and the brighter red areas are where they were fighting and attacking. So you can see that Tal Afar, in between Mosul and Sinjar, was under attack and likely to fall soon because there were areas of support around it. And the city of Sinjar is logically going to be next. The Sinjar region is named after this absolutely huge, very sheer-sided mountain, which dominates what is otherwise a very flat landscape. And it was a very kind of ethnically and religiously diverse area. It was home to Kurds, to Sunni Arab tribes, to Shia Turkmen, to Christians, and also a Yezidi population of around 400,000 people. And this map that I've put on highlights most of the villages in which Yezidis lived. Like these other minorities, Yezidis are also designated for removal from within ISIS territory. But they were to be treated differently. Because their religion, we can talk about it later if you want, but it's a mix of Zoroastrianism and the Abrahamic religions. It's very, very syncretic. It's based on an oral tradition rather than a written text. And also Islam had, for a long time and completely wrongly, accused them of being polytheists. Therefore, ISIS defined them as eligible for enslavement under their own interpretation of Sharia law. On the night of the 2nd of August 2014, tension was rippling through the summer heat. Most Yezidi villages had Kurdish militias guarding them. Some Yezidi men joined these militias on the barricades around their villages, like Safia's father and brothers in Kocho, at the bottom there. Some families had already left. They took the link road up to the Kurdistan region of Iraq, which you can see sort of along the top of that map, just below the Syrian border. And there were other quite large Yezidi communities in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, which is a separate government area. And they expected the Kurds to put up quite a good fight to defend it. So they felt much safer there. Other families were deliberating about whether to leave, or they were already packing their bags. In the evening, Hadia's family heard the sound of fighting to the south, near Gedzerik. And her father was in the military, and he thought that the Kurdish militias and the villagers would fight back. And what they didn't realise was that ISIS would overrun these villages quite so quickly, or that the Kurdish militias would withdraw to Kurdistan overnight, silently, leaving the Sinjar region virtually undefended. Amira had other worries. She had an infant son who was sick. He was about 40 days old at that time. And she had travelled from Gohbal with her husband and other son to Sinjar hospital. By dawn, most Yezidis knew that ISIS was attacking the Sinjar region and that the Kurdish militias had vanished. And for those still there at home, where you were was vital. ISIS was attacking from the south and east, and it quite quickly overran these villages on the south side of the mountain. In Domis, Hadia's father told his family, "They've surrounded Domis, we cannot leave." Arabs from this neighbouring tribe called Albu Mutayawit arrived, and they pointed out to ISIS which houses were Christian and which houses were Yezidi. They had guns, and Hadia's father knew that he wouldn't be able to fight back. Some Yezidis living north of the mountain in the villages that you can see up there managed to escape on back roads up to that link road, because that's where ISIS kind of attacked last. And then they got up to the road leading to the Kurdistan region. Yezidis in the villages much nearer the mountain managed to flee up its slopes. And these slopes are kind of so steep that once you're past the foothills, ISIS effectively can't follow without being very kind of vulnerable to attack. So some of those people then snuck down the next day to fetch provisions and medicine, because they'd gone with nothing. And then at that point, they were caught by ISIS. However, about 50,000 Yezidis remained trapped up there on the mountain, and it's August. There was 50-degree heat. They had no food, no water, and eventually US-backed Kurdish militias managed to open a humanitarian corridor for them to escape into Syria. It's between Sinune and Burak on the map that you can see there. And then from there, they managed to escape into the Kurdistan region and join the others. Those who didn't do this were captured as they fled in cars or on foot. In Sinjar hospital overnight, the wards had started to fill up with wounded soldiers. Amira was with her husband and her sons, and she was waiting for treatment for her baby. She wanted to leave, but her husband wouldn't let them. He left them alone to look for water, and then went to help the wounded soldiers. And she was screaming for him. She tried to call him on his mobile. He answered a couple of times, told her where he was, but said, "Stay where you are." And then he stopped picking up on the phone. A doctor told her that they were trapped and that ISIS had arrived. She found a bloody blanket and she covered her kids with it, and managed to get through to her husband, who said he'd managed to escape the hospital. He'd been confronted by an ISIS soldier. He said, "My wife's in there," and this soldier said, "If you don't leave now, we'll kill you." So he ran. He managed to escape the hospital and get up the mountain. The hospital happens to be right in the foothills of the mountain, just next to a road that goes up it. So he told Amira this on the phone, and then the next moment, framed in the doorway, an ISIS soldier arrived. And she told him, "My children are dead." He took his rifle and he hit me on the head, she said. "I don't know if it was the back of the weapon or not. He hit me on my head and said, 'I will kill you also.' I still have a migraine today." So in these first few hours then, it was mostly complete chaos. People were moving everywhere. ISIS is chasing, arriving, stopping, and capturing them. When Amira woke up, she and some other Yezidis managed to flee the hospital and hide themselves in a nearby empty house in Sinjar. Other Yezidis were captured as they fled that morning. That happened to most of the women that I spoke to, or they were trapped in their villages, like Hadia in Domis and Safia in Kochel. So I'll just stick that one up. Within about 3 days, ISIS completely controlled the Sinjar region, and around 15,000 Yezidis were ensnared in its system of genocidal captivity. Most of these captives who were ensnared were given the option of converting to Islam, and that meant accepting the erasure of their religion and their group identity. Those who refused were categorized by age and gender, and then they were violently separated by Islamic State militias. Men and older boys were taken away and usually massacred. Women and children were loaded onto waiting coaches, animal transporters, or sometimes into their own cars, and they were funneled into a network of registration and holding sites in the cities of Sinjar, Tal Afar, and Mosul. And they used buildings like schools, colleges, even a wedding hall, a prison, to hold them in. Other people were held in their villages, and that's where they were pressured to convert. So in one village, I spoke to a couple of women from there, Tel Banat, ISIS filmed a mass conversion as a PR stunt. And some of these converts were later permitted to get in touch with Arab acquaintances. And these acquaintances would agree to act essentially as a sponsor. And take these Yezidis as their servants under ISIS control. So two women that I spoke to from Tel Banat, a mother and a daughter, spent 3.5 years living with one such Arab sponsor, working on his farm under constant surveillance from IS. In Domis, Hadia remembered, "We stayed for a week in our house. In that week, they did nothing to us. But then they came and asked my father, 'Would you convert to Islam?' My father said no. They went out and they went to a Christian neighbour's house. They killed the men and took their women, daughters." At that point, her father got in touch with an Arab friend, not from the tribe that was collaborating with ISIS, the Mutayawit, and this friend smuggled them out at night in the back of his pickup truck, all laying down on the flatbed. At that point, and he took them to Kochel. And at that point, Kochel and its Yezidi population was still intact. This was, 12th of August or so. ISIS was guarding the village, and it visited every day, pressuring the men to accept conversion. Safia was staying inside the house with her family. She said, "We were afraid to go out. We were like just waiting, uncomfortable, in fear." On the 15th of August, a couple of days after Hadia's family arrived, ISIS called the entire village to the school. They were asked one last time if they would convert. And when they refused, the men and the older boys were violently separated from the women and children. They were taken a short distance away and they were shot. The women and children of Kochel, Safia and Hadia among them, were transferred into the slave system. In the holding sites in Sinjar, Tel Afar and Mosul, older women were sorted from younger women and married women from unmarried. The first site that Safia and Hadia were taken to was just outside Sinjar, where many Yezidi women had already kind of passed through. And Hadia remembered, "We saw some writing on the walls inside. They are taking women." My mother didn't want to show us or say that they will take you and do anything to you, but she always said, don't separate from each other and always stay together. Not long after, older women were taken away and massacred outside. And the sorting continued as Yezidis were kind of funneled through these holding sites. It's almost like pulses, moving. They would stay one day, a few days, a week, as ISIS processed them. Amira had been hiding with her sons and some others who had escaped the hospital in this empty house in Sinjar for 15 days at that time. And then they were found and they were taken to a school in Tel Afar. In that school, she said, there were 200, 300 women and girls. She said they would separate girls who were 14 or 15 into a group, those who were older into a group, those like me who were married with young children in a group. They would register our names, and when they called your name, they would take you. If you didn't go, they would grab your hair and make you crawl along the ground. Amira was actually incredibly lucky, if one can say that. A US Kurdish coalition plane bombed the building, and in the ensuing chaos, she managed to escape with some others. They helped her carry her sons and they fled. They walked by night and they hid by day in the valleys for 3 whole days until they reached Sinjar mountain and the safety of the Kurdish front lines. Her companions carried on towards Syria, and Amira crossed the lines not far from where her brother was actually fighting in a Yezidi battalion. Elsewhere in the network of holding sites, the sorting continued. Sophia and her family had also been taken to Tel Afar. Again, they were given the option to convert, and this time they, like many other families, agreed. ISIS took these convert families to one of 3 deserted villages near Tel Afar, Qasr Kio, Qasr Maharab, and the Al-Khadra neighborhood of Tel Afar. And the first 2 villages were originally inhabited by the minority people from the Turkmen. They're a Shia ethno-religious minority, and they had fled ISIS some months before. Some families had had their men returned to them if they'd also agreed to convert. Some were taken for forced labour, like the family of Pakiza, and another woman that I spoke to last year. Pakiza's family farmed sheep for ISIS all through the dead of winter on a very exposed mountainside. But in these villages, there was no work, but ISIS surveillance was very tight. They guarded the men and boys. They took them 5 times a day to pray. There wasn't very much food, and ISIS was constantly berating them, saying over the loudspeakers that they were infidels, they were dirty Yezidis, they'd been worshipping the wrong god. Sophia remembered it here as a very tense kind of time. She said there was a kind of limbo, there was a veneer of normalcy because you were living with your family in a house and the younger children would actually play together, but the adults obviously were living in fear. They were living according to ISIS's strict rules, and the days were kind of punctuated by acts of extreme brutality. But at some point, ISIS seems to have decided that the people who had agreed to convert, these conversions were false, and they emptied the 3 villages. The men disappeared, and the women were processed into this network of holding and distribution sites. Initially, because she looked so young, Sophia was taken with her younger siblings to a school where Yezidi children were held and they were effectively indoctrinated. 2 women looked after them and they were fed, but they had to memorize verses from the Quran. She said, it was like someone who had a duty. Every morning we would all get up at 7 a.m. and they would teach us about the Quran, the verses, their beliefs. Every morning at 7 a.m. they would go and teach us. But Sophia still prayed as a Yezidi every day at dawn and sunset, according to tradition. Even though we were very young, she said, we still held our beliefs inside us. We knew that if we convinced them and memorized the verses and spoke them, they wouldn't pressure us and torture us. They tried to change our religion, but they didn't. 2 months later, though, she was taken to Mosul to a slave market. This is where the geography expands. Hadia had also been taken to Mosul some 12 months earlier. So both she and Sophia were funneled into this network, this system of sexual slavery. The registration and the distribution procedure was really tightly controlled. According to Islamic State's interpretation of Sharia law, 1/5 of the captives would be transferred to Islamic State as spoils of war. They were usually distributed to fighters and to high-ranking officials, and the remainder would then be sold to IS members. From ISIS's perspective, this enslavement and this forced conversion achieved the demographic disappearance of the Yezidis, but it also aided the recruitment of fighters from Iraq, from Syria, also from abroad, as most of us know. These men were attracted by the prospect of owning sex slaves, and it also generated huge revenues, up to $21 million, at a time when the organization was needing funds in order to properly establish itself as a state. Hadia told me that about 100 girls were crammed in 3 rooms in an abandoned house in a Christian neighborhood of Mosul. The guards did not usually rape them because that would devalue them. As I said, this was actually a very disciplined procedure. They would mostly give the younger girls as gifts to IS military elite, known as emirs. And these men would walk around the room lifting girls' faces with like a stick or a gun, and they would take anyone who they liked. Anyone who resisted was beaten and dragged crawling by their hair. So the same as Amira said. Hadia was in that house for 2 months with 2 sisters and a friend. And one day a Ukrainian foreign fighter came with 2 of his sons and another man. She said, when they came that day, they just looked at us. The next day, they took us. Our eyes were blindfolded, they put niqabs on us, and they took us to a police headquarters by car. The girls were then distributed, and the Ukrainian emir took Hadia. She told me, he said, I will rape you, but I didn't understand what that meant. That was the start of 1 year of extreme torture for Hadia. And I want to make clear here that she gave me quite a few details of that torture. She was extremely open about it, and the stories are completely stomach-churning, but I'm actually choosing not to retell them in this particular forum. And I think we have to think very carefully about what the point of such detailed descriptions and details would be. I don't think I need them to convince you in this forum that Hadia and others had multiple crimes committed against them. And details like that also have the habit of overwhelming and sickening the listener, which means that some of you might not be able to listen properly for a while. So I'll do what many of the women do, which is to parcel out their stories in terms of time. Hadia was kept captive by that Ukrainian for about a year, and he took her with him from Mosul to Syria, to a region called Frisia. She was then sent to Raqqa to be gifted after a year to an Iraqi from Ramadi. She stayed there a week, and then this Iraqi took her to Hasaka. She stayed there a year. She worked like a servant for his family, and during that time, she got pregnant with twins. She miscarried, and she nearly died. The Iraqi was killed in battle, and his legal wife took her to court to be sold to another Iraqi, this time from Mosul. She gave birth to the previous one's child during that time. She was about 5 months pregnant when she was sold. She was then forcibly married to another ISIS member, a different one from Mosul. After 6 months, his hand was wounded in battle, and ISIS decided to send him to Turkey for treatment. They were captured by the Kurdish militia as they attempted to cross the border. And she told them that she was a Yezidi, but she and her baby were actually not released. They were put in a prison and then a camp with other ISIS women by the Kurdish authorities, apparently while her case was processed. And it was only the intervention by an American organization that was visiting to repatriate, but to take into prison systems its own men. Only this organization that actually got her out, but her baby was taken from her, and it was sent elsewhere to be adopted. She was released on the 4th of July, 2019. Roughly at the time that Hadia had been sent to Raqqa by the Ukrainian, Sofia was taken from the school in Tel Afar to a house in Mosul with about 25 other young women, none of whom she knew. Gradually, the girls were sold off in groups until she was taken alone in a car to what they called a madafa. Traditionally, it's a guest house, but here ISIS used it as a kind of women's dormitory that was under guard. And the man who bought her had kept her there for about 8 months. Another man took her to a different madafa for about a week. And then she spent about another month in a different house. It was Ramadan. There were about 7 girls of them, and they were made to do all of the cooking and the cleaning for these men. Then 2 other men came, and they took Sofia and a friend. This was different. They were integrated into the households effectively as slaves. And the family who took Sophia was extremely brutal to her. She was glad when, after about a week, they moved on and they left her with her friend's family. And there the treatment was much better. Sophia told me, when ISIS put us in those houses, it's like they were not responsible for us, their wives were. But in this other house, my friend's house, they were treating her well. You can say like part of the family, like a daughter. They were not forcing us to do the housework. And when she cooked, sometimes she would tell us to come so that we would learn cooking. After about a month, some neighbours wanted to adopt Sophia, and at the beginning they forced her to do the work, and it was bad treatment. But she said, we had to protect ourselves to not face the same thing, by which she meant being used as a sex slave. So Sophia forced herself to fit in. But by now it was 2017 and Mosul was coming under increasing attack from the Kurdish militia who were pushing back against ISIS. Planes were continually hitting the city, and this fear of the air and of bombardment and of drones and of people watching you is something that I heard a lot of Yezidi women speaking about. And at this time, because there's such movement, the front lines were shifting constantly. Many Yezidi women ended up being kind of carted around with Islamic State fighters from city to city as their territory kind of reduced. But Sophia was actually captured along with the family by these anti-ISIS forces. Her story doesn't end there. It should have done, but it didn't. The women of this family were released and they ended up selling her and her friend to a Kurdish guy who was living in Kirkuk. He was pro-ISIS. He kept them as slaves while he worked for ISIS, setting off small explosive devices. Essentially, he would push a pram around the city and leave it somewhere and a bomb would go off. They were there for 4 whole years until the Kurdish authorities managed to catch up with him, and that's when she was released in 2021. So every escape story is different. Amira managed to escape the school after it was bombed. Hadia should have been released when she was caught with her ISIS husband and baby crossing the Turkish border. Sophia was only released when the Kurdish authorities identified this guy in Kirkuk. But I also want to mention the extensive smuggling network that had kind of sprung up. There used to be many people who would smuggle cigarettes or alcohol across national borders. But when ISIS took over within Islamic State, they also smuggled Yezidis. Sometimes a woman would manage to get hold of her captor's phone and she'd call a family member on the outside, or they'd get hold of his laptop and they'd manage to send a Facebook message to a family member. And then the families and other Yezidi organizations would gather money together and they would pay smugglers to help these women escape. After a couple of years, actually, after ISIS began to lose its territory, ISIS members themselves were also beginning to sell Yezidi women back to their families, largely because they could get about 3 times as much cash out of them as they could if they traded these women within Islamic State. So it wasn't permitted, but it was worth it financially for them. But today, about 2,600 Yezidis are still missing, and it's thought that a large number of them are hidden in Al-Hol, which is a prison camp in northern Syria. It's between Sinjar and Hasaka on that map. Thought that they're held there. There are about 40,000 ISIS members within this camp. It's difficult to get the Yezidis out because within the camp, ISIS has absolute and complete control, political control, and it's exceptionally dangerous. The Kurdish authorities have control of the outside, but not the inside. So Yezidi women can't simply kind of walk up to the camp authorities and identify themselves and be let out. Others are suspected to be hidden in Turkey with ISIS families that they went to, and other countries that ISIS members fled to when Islamic State collapsed. So the geography narrows again. For those who made it to the camps in the Kurdistan region of Iraq, they rejoined the Yezidi community. This process of reintegration has been really, really difficult. In this community, rape and conversion and marriage outside the community are traditionally extremely taboo. If you broke these taboos, you would no longer be considered Yezidi. But in 2015, the Baba Sheikh, who's the Yezidi religious leader, announced that anyone who escaped would be welcomed back into the community no matter what had happened to them, because it wasn't their fault. And they developed a new baptism ritual to symbolically cleanse them and purify them. But underneath this kind of story of reacceptance, there are still tensions, there are new taboos, and there are definite hierarchies. Women with children born of rape find that their children are likely to be completely ostracized from the Yezidi community or taken from them, more or less forcibly, as happened to Hadia. Knowing that they'll lose their children is a reason that some Yezidi women don't do their best to escape ISIS. And 10 years on, even the youngest Yezidi girl is now actually eligible for marriage in ISIS's ideology. So almost all of the 2,600 remaining are quite likely to have children. Another taboo is the accusation of voluntary conversion to Islam, or not being held kind of properly captive. The women that I mentioned at the beginning from Tal Banat, who spent 3.5 years living with an Arab family friend within ISIS territory and under surveillance, are marginalised because they're not considered to have kind of properly survived and because they voluntarily converted. And finally, those who weren't raped or who did not spend very long in captivity, like Amira, are not also considered true survivors. As Amira said to me, "I'm not saying that I've been tortured like others, but what happened was enough. Some have said they don't believe me, that I'm lying, despite everything that I've been through." And Amira is not the only woman that I spoke to with such a story. And these hierarchies that I've described have real effects. In 2021, Iraq's government passed the Yezidi Survivors Law, which is supposed to provide compensation worth about twice a normal pension to those who survived captivity. And there's kind of wraparound care with education and psychological care, that kind of stuff too. Only a fraction of people have actually received it so far. And that fraction includes Hadia and Safia, whose stories are really clear-cut. But the mother and daughter from Tal Banat have effectively been prevented from applying. The village leader of Tal Banat will not support their application because he says they agreed to convert to Islam. And at the time that they went to this Arab family friend, ISIS issued them with basically a certificate that permitted them to leave ISIS control. They now have this certificate and that's being held against them. And they need this guy's support in order to actually apply for compensation. So when when Amira, the slightly older woman, went to the government offices to apply, she said, "They didn't believe me. They told me to go and bring those people back who escaped to you with you and helped you carry your sons. And I told them, from where do you want me to bring them back? I don't know where they are. They said that they were going to Syria." She said, "It's not enough that I'm rescued and that I'm here now. They just don't believe me." And this process of applying for the Yezidi Survivors Law, as I've probably outlined, is also just deeply problematic. It often involves travel to the official courts in Sinjar and Mosul, where the survivor has to lodge a legal case complaint. But this travel is obviously very expensive for refugees. And their testimony is taken there, usually by a male court official or police official, or a pair of them. It's then often taken again in one of the offices in the Kurdish regional government, again, usually by male officials. So this is a deeply uncomfortable experience for these women. And when I asked the young woman from Tal Banat, who's been denied compensation, what the process was like, she said, "It's like an investigation, an interrogation." And the format of these interviews is also deeply problematic. And that's where I want to bring us back to some of my points at the beginning about testimony and claims of comprehensive memory. When survivors' testimonies are taken, because they're effectively a legal statement, which would serve to prosecute a perpetrator, there's a focus on very precise information and the listing of dates and times and people and places and modes of transport, and names of perpetrators and what they said and did. My first couple of interviews were with slightly younger women, And, you know, we know a lot about trauma and its effects on memory. People don't remember details like this. So I was quite bewildered when they started rattling off that they were 3 days in this place, and then they were taken here at 2 o'clock, and then the journey lasted 3 hours and it was by car. And then they were in a room with 250, 300 people for 2 days, and then, and so on. So it's all very precise information that they would parcel out. And that's because these interviews are also often cross-checked. An inconsistent testimony, inconsistent legal testimony in this very interrogatory atmosphere is a real problem. So hence, I remember all of my story. I remember all of it very well, and I will not forget it. So these are claims, not just of the enormity of what happened to them, but also claims for the compensation that they're eligible for, but often denied. So I think that's a reasonably apposite point to end on. For anyone who's interested in the politics and the situation of Yezidis today in Iraq, sorry, plug coming. I'd enjoy you to join our hybrid event tomorrow night with the Wiener Holocaust Library. I'm going to be in conversation with Hawan Omer and Khalida Ilyas, who are from Free Yezidi Foundation. It's a charity that I partnered with to get these interviews, and they do a lot of reconstruction work with Yezidi community in Iraq. So it should be quite a good event. But so, you know, I'm happy to answer any questions about these Yezidis now, if you like, or about the genocide or women's testimony. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. So if you have a question, feel free to either put your hand up or stick it in the chat, and we'll get to as many as possible. I'm going to take sort of chair's privilege and ask a question first. I mean, you sort of already alluded to it in sort of the preciseness, but how did you find, well, what sort of were the key differences that you found in interviewing these genocide survivors from such a recent genocide compared to, say, looking at testimony from Holocaust survivors who, you know, it might be decades since the events that they experienced?
Thank you. It's a good question. I've been listening and watching Holocaust testimony for years, and so this is my first set of interviews, and I was expecting something similar, but it definitely didn't happen that way. And these interviews, interrogatory interviews, I think, are the root of that. So I took the kind of life history approach and told them very clearly that I was a historian, not a lawyer, not a humanitarian. I couldn't help them in that way. And said that I'd like to start out by talking about where they grew up. And this kind of threw them, which was interesting. It was hard for them to, you know, they didn't understand why I wanted to know about these kind of things. And I said, you know, I want to conjure for my readers what life was like before. Whereas I think in Holocaust studies, you get a lot of kind of nostalgic reconstructions almost of childhood and villages that are now lost and so on. So I'm not sure if that's because very few historians have actually interviewed these women and it's a different context, or whether it's something to do with time. Perhaps if they start returning, things will be different. I'm not sure. Yes, and then as I said, you get a lot of kind of very chronological factual information, which was not really what I wanted. I wanted, obviously, the emotions, the things that they remembered, the things that particularly stood out to them, you know, allowing for age, obviously, and certainly some of the slightly older women were happier to go off script, as it were, and to I mean, some of them were complete firebrands and would tell me all sorts of stuff. So they were a little bit more fluid in their telling. I think the younger ones certainly were more comfortable or more happy, you know, with the back and forth questions and answering in those sorts of ways. So, I mean, I'd really love to go back in 10 years. I mean, I'd love to go back tomorrow, but in 10 years and 20 years to see how these women tell the story differently over time. I think that would be something that's really interesting to do. And I'm sure that people working on Rwanda or Bosnia, where there's been a similar kind of humanitarian jump in the immediate aftermath and lots of testimony taking, would probably have something similar to say to me.
Laura, do you want to unmute and ask your question?
Hey, first of all, thank you, Rebecca, for this talk. This was incredibly illuminating, and it's a subject that I don't think has gotten as much attention as it should, especially when all of this was happening. I remember when it was happening, but the focus was largely on political gains, as it would stand for Western countries, and there was this sort of erasure of these Yazidi people, especially women, who were undergoing massive, massive trauma during this time.
Mm.
Um, I'm curious if any of the survivors ultimately left the region completely and moved overseas. What was the expatriation trend like? And were other countries welcoming to Yazidi refugees,
Mhm.
any in particular, or if most of them just found it impossible to leave and had to stay in the region?
Thank you. That's a really good question. Okay, I'll start out with the Germans because they kicked this off in a particular region of Germany. A program led by a German Yezidi psychologist kicked off in about 2015, and that program took in the end, I think 1,200 Yezidi women from 2015 through early 2016. And they brought them over. It was sort of done under the auspices of the German military at the time, actually, which sort of solved the airspace issue. And they brought them over and they've rehoused them. It was a very good film, which we showed as part of the exhibition kind of events program by Suzanne Cardelian, who actually went and interviewed three of these women who ended up in Germany. It's called Inside Her, Inside Me. It just finished last year, just finished kind of production last year. It's very good. So they've been receiving treatment and as kind of slowly integrating. The government initially tried to send them back, but they were the three that she followed anyway. Three women were given indefinite leave to remain eventually, or the German equivalent thereof. So there was a program that took about 1,100 of them. My problem with that program is that it tended to split families up. Yeah, so Hadia has a brother and one sister there in Germany, but because she was released, or she escaped in 2019, released, she's no longer eligible for this program. So she can't go out to join what remains of her family. She's living with her uncle at the moment in a camp called Fanke outside De Hoek. And her uncle's family is great to her, but I'm sure she'd rather be with the brothers and sisters that she has left. And her brother and sister also live five hours apart in Germany. So in terms of kind of refugee integration, where we know that people who come over as part of a family integrate better, it seems a little bit lackluster. And then, of course, for Merkel, it became politically impossible to continue accepting refugees. Otherwise, there's quite a large Yezidi community in Nebraska. Don't know why, but there. Some in Canada. Canada took quite a few refugees. The recent one has been Australia. One of the women, the first woman that I spoke to, actually just happened to be visiting Iraq for the first time since she left 4 years, I think, previously. And we just happened to kind of catch up with her family, and she told us where she was, and then I interviewed her. So there's quite a few little colonies of them in Australia, and that's where Hadia would like to go with her uncle. The UK has taken 52, which is fabulous. Yep. And apart from that, you hear where would you like to go, and a lot of the refugees will say now not Europe, because they hear that it's not a great place for refugees, and they're more interested in the English-speaking countries outside. So those are the kind of sort of scatterings, and that of course is its own other issue, because in genocide terms, in terms of the definition of it, because the nature of the religion ties them quite closely to the land. So if they leave, that's a problem. Also, Yezidism is kind of sustained by, you can only marry within. You can't convert in. You can only marry within, and there are also 3 castes, and you have to marry someone from within your caste. Ergo, this kind of scattering makes it very difficult to culturally and I guess in terms of bloodline and heritage, maintain them as a group. So it's sort of enacting genocide by force that way. So the largest community, though, is in Kurdistan region at the moment, and they're not in Sinjar. They haven't really returned. Do you want me to speak about that?
Yeah, please.
Yeah, I can do that. So they're stuck in the camps at the moment. The Kurdistan region is a kind of separatist region, and then there's Iraq. The Sinjar region is actually disputed between the federal government of Iraq and the Kurdistan region. Both would like control of it. That used to mean that both would court the Yezidis and try and use their votes essentially. But now post-genocide, Iraq doesn't want to pay for the return, and the Kurds know that they've blotted their copybook badly because they disappeared in the middle of the night and left the Yezidis open to it, and it's also not a great atmosphere in Kurdistan at the moment. So now neither government is interested in supporting them, and this region just remains very underfunded. There's the infrastructure is completely shot from the wars to regain it, and there are many militia, many flags. So they literally don't feel safe to go home, even if they actually still have a home to go home to. So they're stuck in these camps. I think about 200,000 of them at the moment. But the Kurdistan government would like to now close the camps, and they've said that this will happen. I think it's by September. But they've not said what's going to happen to anybody afterwards. They're not given jobs, they're not integrated, there's no house building going on, so it's a really sticky situation for them, hence why they all just want to leave, and mostly to Australia, Canada and so on.
Thanks for the question, Laura. So we've got a few in the chat. First of all, we've got a comment from Gail saying thank you so much for an important lecture and for sharing our people's life stories. And then we've got a question. Someone was interested in, you mentioned at first you couldn't show any pictures of the survivors because of backlash, and they're asking where that backlash would be coming from.
Yeah, thank you. Whenever there's a news item on, there's a very slow trickle of Yezidis coming out. 1 month, maybe one will be rescued. I think a couple of months ago, 6 were taken out of our hole in one go. There are news reports, and underneath that in the comments, there will be a lot of hate speech. And just before I went to Iraq last year, it was May, there was a complete spate of this. And let me tell you about why. There was a girl who'd escaped captivity, and she'd returned with her family to Sinjar, one of the few who'd returned. She spotted her captor on the street and went to the police to tell them. And it ended up with the local community accusing the Yezidis of destroying a mosque, and fake pictures circulated of a mosque that had been destroyed some years before. And over the space of about a month, a lot of the extremist or radical mullahs in the mosques were calling for ISIS, or for anyone to finish what ISIS had started. So there was a massive spike in kind of hate speech. So this is what you get underneath any article about them. It's a lot of stuff about how ISIS, they should go back to ISIS, they're dirty, all of the kind of stereotypical hate speech that they normally get. And of course, it's upsetting. So the survivors that I spoke to, some of them mentioned that and said, expressly, I don't want my picture or my words to be on social media. I think when it's about them specifically, it's probably, it's bad when they just see an article about someone else with these comments, but when it's you specifically, it's going to be worse. So that's why I more or less took the decision to keep all of them off social media. Hence why I'm not showing pictures tonight. I'm sure no one here is going to do it, but screenshots are possible. So it just makes me feel more comfortable that it's not me causing that to happen. Made the exhibition promo quite difficult though.
Yeah, I can imagine, yeah. And someone else has asked, so what was it about the Yezidi experience, genocide, that drew you to do this research?
Thank you, good question. I started out working on the Armenian genocide after my PhD. I'd come across some really interesting photographs of Armenian women who, during the genocide of 1915, they weren't killed. they were captured. They were taken into Turkish or Kurdish or Arabic households. They were forced to convert. They were forced to have their names changed. They were forced to speak a different language. And they were kept captive in a very similar system of sexual slavery, or kept as wives or kept as daughters, and they were sold. And so I'd started working on this about 2011. So in summer 2014, the images coming out of Iraq, some of them are visually very similar, which doesn't mean anything historically, but for someone working on that, it's like a jolt of recognition. And the stories that you hear, likewise in terms of reintegration. Armenian women also had these taboos of rape, of conversion. So the Armenian community was also very kind of hesitant and not quite sure what to do with them, and if they were fit to be reintegrated and that kind of thing. So that's what led me to it. I just wanted to explore these echoes, basically, and I think it's worked out quite well.
We've still got time for any more questions, but I have a question. So my research is currently focusing on Holocaust denial, and obviously denial is sort of the final stage of any genocide. Have you seen denial of the Yezidi genocide happening?
Not myself, but I know that it does. Yeah. Yeah, I think it's part of this hate speech that nothing much happened to them. I think perhaps more seriously than that, it's the fact that it disappears from public view. Like, we don't see it in the news very much anymore. These things get kind of replaced by other other atrocities. And so even the Uyghurs in China, which was, there was a spike in articles about them, and that's kind of now died down. So no, it's not denial per se, but in terms of it being recognized in the public sphere, it doesn't happen very often. Recognition itself, the UK government recognized it last summer legally, but their policy is that they can't recognise a genocide unless it's been defined by a court legally as genocide. So there were 3 court cases in Germany over the last few years. It was only when the 3rd one, that wasn't under appeal, defined it as a genocide, that the UK government actually kind of stepped up and did anything about it. So there's despite the fact that the UN recognised in 2016 and called it a genocide then, there's an extreme kind of hesitation of doing anything about it.
Someone just put in the chat, did you meet all the survivors in person? Was it over video chat? How was that sort of arranged, the logistics, I guess?
Video chat for me would be unethical, also impractical, because there's no electricity in refugee camps often, or there is, but it's dodgy. And the internet's dodgy as well. So no, I wouldn't want to do it online. So yeah, I went. I partnered with this charity, Free Yezidi Foundation. They were fabulous and very in tune with the kind of ethics of what I wanted to do. We used their office space, which is important because it has a kind of a more private atmosphere, basically. And women don't necessarily want their male family members listening outside the tent. So having that office space was really important. I had an interpreter. I don't speak Kurdish. She was great at kind of, keeping people chatting, calming everyone down, making everything a bit kind of more fluid. Obviously, there are then kind of issues with the fact that she's interpreting and it's not a full translation. And some of them, I mean, that's the other point about interviews there. Some of them are not really used to having an interpreter, so they'd speak for about 2 minutes, and the poor girl was like trying to keep it all in her brain and then reproduce it, but we have it, on recording to do later. But she did a fantastic job. So yeah, and I took a Welsh photojournalist with me called Claire Thomas to do the photography aspect for the exhibition. She's got quite a lot of experience in Iraq, so it was really useful having her there, an all-women space, just to kind of have someone else listening, I think was important as well. Yeah.
Thank you so much. Well, I can't see any more questions, and that's actually perfect timing. So now there's no more questions, I'll just first of all say thank you, Becca, for joining us. It's been truly fascinating and illuminating. And yeah, if you can get to any of the other events around the exhibition, or can make it to the exhibition, I would strongly urge you to do so. The exhibition's excellent. And as I mentioned at the beginning, I will send out the recording tomorrow, as well as our short survey. So please either share the recording with friends, colleagues, family who might find the event interesting, and then any feedback is always welcome. And we have some more events coming up, both online and in person. The last of our online events is in a few weeks, looking at Iraq again, actually, but the Jewish experience in Iraq. So please join us for that. And we have some great in-person stuff coming up as well. So all that is on our website, social media, all the places that you would usually expect to find us. So yeah, thank you again, Rebecca. Thank you for everyone joining us, and have a lovely evening. Thank you.